Europe's frozen north, a world of snow and ice. Deserted, barren, and remote. Only in the brief summer does the Arctic disclose its secrets and reveal traces of a story that has almost been forgotten. Northern Norway in the winter of 1942. It's now 18 months since German troops entered the Arctic Circle, Hitler's northernmost deployment area for the attack on Russia. But temperatures as low as -60, a tundra devoid of roads, and fierce resistance from the Red Army have resulted in a deadlock at the front. For months now, thousands of soldiers have been trapped in the Arctic winter. They're at the end of their tether. The Germans have entered into an alliance with the Finns. Together, their forces have crossed the border into the Soviet Union. The objective? To capture Murmansk and cut the Murman railway line. The rail link from the ice-free Arctic port is the sole source of supplies for Leningrad, and thus the Soviet Union's most vital artery. But the Germans and the Finns are not even close to achieving their goal. Now, the aim is to neutralize Murmansk, not with ground troops, but from the air. But not even the massive air raids launched by the Luftwaffe can sever the supply link from Murmansk. The port is fiercely defended by the Red Army. Many of the planes fail to return to their airfields in Finland and Norway. In fact, losses are so high that more than half the German aircrews will not survive the war. And the Luftwaffe is facing other serious problems. The weather in the Arctic is often bad, and the Air Force, like the Navy, can only operate effectively with the help of accurate forecasts.
Sometimes we needed fog for camouflage purposes. Then, at other times, we needed fine weather so the pilots could recognize things. So it was vital to have accurate weather reports.
Since the outbreak of war, Germany had been cut off from international weather forecasts. So the Air Force and the Navy carried out their own meteorological reconnaissance flights. Pilots recorded the air pressure, the temperature, and the wind speed, sometimes flying 1,000 kilometers out into the Arctic Ocean as far as the 80th parallel. With regard to gathering weather information, the German Navy found the Svalbard archipelago particularly interesting. It even set up permanent meteorological stations on the islands. From the most northerly point of the European mainland, the North Cape, it's over 1,000 kilometres to Svalbard, whose name literally means cold edge. It's in these Arctic latitudes that the weather for the whole of Western and Central Europe is formed. So meteorological data from this region was vital to every country involved in the war. In a military operation, Germany set up the Crusader weather station on Spitsbergen, the most westerly of the Svalbard Islands. The undertaking was headed by 28-year-old Hans Robert Knospel, a pioneer of Arctic weather stations. Some 9 months later, when the base was being evacuated, Knospel was fatally injured by one of the mines placed around an automatic weather station. In accordance with his last wishes, he was buried on Spitsbergen. While hundreds of thousands of young men were dying anonymously on the battlefields of Europe, here the sad loss of Hans Robert Knospel was something extraordinary. He was buried with full military honours. On the mainland, the war had a totally different aspect to it. German troops were stationed throughout Finland, and these young men sought the company of Finnish girls. Despite the war and the occupation, there was a great yearning on both sides for love. Known as Lotters, Finnish women came into contact with German soldiers every day. They were the good-hearted souls at the military bases who took care of the food and clothing and looked after the sick.
No Lotan tehtävät oli semmoinen, että sitä niin kuului laillaan siihen valmiuteen.
As a Lotter, you always had to be on call. I was a member of the team that served food at the waterworks. Guards were stationed there. We took meals to their billets. We did the cleaning and washing and anything else that needed attending to.
Ja tiskattiin ja aina kun tuli semmoisia niin.
During the war, there were Lotters all over Finland. It gave young women the chance to earn some money of their own. Heli-Maja Peltoniemi also seized the opportunity and worked in a German supply camp.
Mä olin niin lapsi.
I was still a child, so innocent. The Germans were extremely polite. They came up to you and wanted to talk, but I was scared. I'd never been in a situation like that before.
But other opportunities presented themselves. Helmi Finka, for instance, worked as a waitress in the cafe her parents ran in Kemijärvi. There she got to know Hans, a German soldier. After work, he walked her home.
No niin, se oli tosiaankin, että
Later he asked me if, how should I put it, he could come in, so I allowed it.
Hän pyysi, että jos sais sisällekin tulla ja no minä lupasin.
And then we were alone at home,
Siellä tosiaankin
together,
sitten kotona.
just like that.
Kotona ihan noin vaan.
Heli-Maija Peltoniemi also got to know a German soldier.
Se oli vartijapäällikkö. Vaikka minä sen tiesin, että
He was in charge of the guardhouse. I knew he was a lot older than me, but I was looking for some security. Life in those days was so
se
uncertain.
oli turvatonta elämä kuitenkin.
Niin, no sitä ennenhän mä tietysti tulin raskaaksi ja
Then I became pregnant.
niin. No sitten,
I'd been pregnant for quite a while before people, as they do of course, began to gossip and say, she's expecting a child from a German.
sanoneet siitä, että kun saksalaiselle nyt ottaa.
Siellä useimmiten meni näin.
That was quite common. Lots of girls became pregnant. The men were then sent to the front and the girls went away. That was the last I heard of most of them, so I wasn't the only one, by no means.
There were 3 points of assault on the front, all of them directed at the Murman Railway, which linked the port of Murmansk with Leningrad and carried vital armaments from Britain and the United States into the hinterland. The Red Army did everything it could to defend this supply route. From 1942 through to the spring of 1944, the front remained static. Then, the Soviets launched a massive offensive. The German forces had to pull further and further back.
The Russians came swarming up like ants, a mass of grey. My God, I wondered, how are we going to survive? Then someone shouted, "Open fire!" But I said, "Wait a second." I knelt down with my 42 under my arm and squeezed the trigger. You didn't really have any feelings. You did what you had to do to stay alive. That's how it was.
All three sides, the Germans, the Russians and the Finns, suffered appalling losses.
Keskitys oli loppunut ja hyökkäys oli saatu torjutuksi.
When the attack had been repulsed, wounded Russian soldiers lay in no man's land between the lines. Some were whimpering while others were in agony with terrible injuries.
Shots were heard and the screaming stopped.
That was really disturbing. But it wasn't the Finns who did it. We tried to help the wounded, not to shoot them.
Mentally, the men were reaching the end of their tether. death became more and more a part of everyday life.
We were taking heavy artillery fire. I was lying in a ditch, a kind of a hollow, when I was told to report to my commanding officer. My corporal, Bindrin, asked if he could use the hollow. There were very few places like that which you could crawl into, so I told him he could. I hadn't gone more than 40 or 50 paces when a shell exploded up in the trees, and I heard screams. Bindrin, who'd crawled into my hole, was dead.
Ich kann mich sogar noch an einen gefreiten Helgot erinnern.
I can even remember a Lance Corporal Helgot. He was 18 years old, a blond lad from Bavaria. He'd stepped on a mine which had ripped him apart from the waist down. But he was still conscious. He reached into his bag and took out some pictures and other things, and asked me to send them to his mother. Then he removed his watch and said, "This is for you."
On some sections of the front, Finns and Germans fought the Russians in combined units.
Sitten saksalainen joukkue tuli siihenkin minun tukikohtaan ja teltta jäi niille.
A company of Germans came to my base and we let them have our tent.
Näin tuskin me olimme päässeet pois siltä tunturilta.
We'd scarcely left when the Russians noticed the changeover.
Ryssä oli huomannut tämä vaiho ja niinhän oli
During the evening, they secretly crept up the hill and killed around 10 or 12 Germans in the tent.
Toistakymmentä, oliko se 12 saksalaista siihen telttaan.
The dead and the wounded were taken to Pakina, column after column of them.
Since 1941, the sea route through the Arctic Ocean had also been fiercely contested. Allied convoys consisting of up to 30 ships made for Murmansk, freighters escorted by units of the Royal Navy. In the early stages, many of these supply vessels were sunk by German submarines, and thousands of Allied seamen died in the icy waters, among them many Norwegians.
Ärligt talt, vi var livrädda de tyska ubåtarna.
To be honest, we were terrified of German submarines. They were so dangerous. We could even feel when they were near. Every time some other ship was sunk, it was like being on death row and getting a reprieve. You'd been given a temporary pardon, a stay of execution. But then the danger returned.
The German Luftwaffe also turned into a deadly threat for the Allied convoys. Since 1942, the Tirpitz had been stationed in Norway. Hitler's biggest battleship and the pride of the German Navy, it was berthed for most of the time in the Fettenfjord north of Trondheim. After its sister ship, the Bismarck, was sunk, the Germans were worried that the Tirpitz might share the same fate, especially having now become the main target of the British. Although it was protected from air attack, largely using artificial fog, British pilots still managed to find the Tirpitz.
I remember one incident particularly well. We were having lunch when the air raid alarm sounded. I ran to my post. We spotted a Spitfire, which, it seemed, was only on a reconnaissance mission. After the war, we got to see the pictures the Spitfire had taken of the Tirpitz at its birth.
Over 700 aircraft were dispatched to destroy the warship. Many were brought down by flak from the Tirpitz, plunging into the sea or crashing on the nearby mainland. Hundreds of British airmen died in the attack. Time and again, secret commando operations were launched in the attempt to destroy the Tirpitz, but none of them proved totally successful. Then, on November the 12th, 1944, the Royal Air Force dealt the German Navy's flagship a decisive blow. Struck by special bombs, each weighing more than 5 tons, the battleship capsized. "971 sailors perished.
We were filled with sadness at the death of so many shipmates, men we'd lived and worked with for so long. I lost a friend and fellow crew member I'd shared quarters with for many years. It was terrible.
The sinking of the Tirpitz gave the Allied naval forces ultimate supremacy in the far north. More and more convoys reached Murmansk without loss. The situation on the mainland also changed.
Husker en gang en tysker som var nede ved Pasvikelven og vasket en bil.
There was this German washing a car down by the river Pasvik. "How are things?" I asked him in German. "Shit," he replied. "It's all shit," he said. "Why is it shitty?" I asked him. And then he told me that the Allies were bombing German towns and cities. Because of the air raids, he said, people were in great need. "It's just shit," he said. "It's really shitty."
Kirkenes was also attacked from the air by Soviet bombers. Located in the far northeast of Norway, the town was full of German troops. The civilian population sought protection in air raid shelters or in shafts in the nearby ore mines.
Somebody shouted, "Lights out," and it became pitch dark in the tunnel. We children sat on the rails listening to the sound of water running down the walls. It's a scene I'll never forget.
Entä idag?
Ja, 4. juli 1944.
On July the 4th, 1944, Kirkenes suffered a particularly heavy bombing raid. Unfortunately, the Soviet Air Force hit the main water supply. As a result, there was no water for putting out the fires. The air raids, which had begun on June the 22nd, 1944, destroyed roughly half the town.
The Soviet advance could no longer be stopped. The Red Army drove the Germans out of parts of Finland, including the strategically important town of Petsamo.
We just didn't have enough men to defeat the Russians, who fought bravely. Very bravely.
The loss of the nickel mines at Petsamo was a body blow to the German armaments industry. The ore was a vital raw material for the nation's steelworks. For thousands of German soldiers, the war in the Arctic ended in a Soviet prisoner of war camp. At the front, everything was collapsing, but away from it, a false calm prevailed.
Niin, ne oli tosiaankin sitten niin pojat soittaneet sairaalaan ja...
Hans's colleagues had telephoned the hospital. He was called into the hut and they raised their glasses. They sat Hans on the table and had a real celebration. Hans, of course, was delighted that he had a son.
Ja olihan se mielissään, kun oli poika.
Suddenly, however, the soldiers had to say goodbye to their loved ones. The Germans were being pulled out of Finland.
It wasn't a real farewell. We were standing in a small room, just a corner really. No, it wasn't a proper farewell. We went outside and a nurse came towards us. We waved and said, "See you soon." And that was it.
Ja Hans oli jouluaatto.
Hans rang up to say I should come and say goodbye, as his unit had to leave for Norway. We had to do our parting at the station. So Hans didn't even spend that first Christmas at home with us. That's the way it was.
So what had happened? On September the 2nd, 1944, Finnish Marshal Carl Gustaf Mannerheim informed Adolf Hitler in a personal letter that Finland would cease hostilities against the Soviet Union. To safeguard the existence of the Finnish nation, he had negotiated a separate armistice with Stalin and hoped Hitler would understand. In response, however, the Führer took a horrendous step. That same day he commanded his troops to withdraw, but he also ordered them to destroy the land as they went, a scorched earth policy designed to impede the Soviet advance. Tromsø, northern Norway, September 1944. In the midst of the collapse, the German Navy mounted another secret operation in the Arctic Ocean. it took a detachment right through the route taken by Allied convoys. The destination was Vörde Bay in Northeastland, a remote area north of Spitsbergen.
This will become your second homeland, Dr. Deger said. We had finally left civilization behind. Now he could tell us that.
The leader of the expedition, Dr. Wilhelm Deger, was a teacher with experience of the Arctic, but he wasn't a soldier. His task was to set up the Haudegen weather station. A hut was built from prefabricated sections. It was designed to last for 2 years. As the 11 men prepared to spend the winter in Vörde Bay, the 2 ships that had brought them departed, before the ice masses from the North Pole sealed off the fjord for many months. Now the Haudegen weather team was left entirely to its own devices.
Up there, we felt the war was so far away. The stillness of the landscape was something totally alien to us, and it took a fair bit of getting used to. It was certainly a problem for me. When you were out walking, you could hear your own heart beating.
Autumn arrived, and with it the first storms. Recording temperatures as low as -58 degrees Celsius, the men gained their first experience of a truly hostile environment. Still, they made themselves at home in their hut and embarked on their task of observing the weather in the Arctic. It was not until October, when the polar night set in, that the meteorologists were safe from detection by the Allies. Up to that point, they had maintained strict radio silence to avoid being attacked. Now, under the cover of darkness, they could transmit their encoded weather data to Germany. At the same time, in eastern Finland the German withdrawal was in full swing. Stalin had made it a condition that the Germans had to pull out of Finland within 2 weeks. But that just wasn't enough time. So now the Soviet Union was pressuring the Finnish military to drive out the Germans by force.
First we were brothers in arms, and then enemies. I don't think we should have had to fight each other. We Finns don't like fighting. We'd done enough fighting against the Russians. The will to fight had evaporated. But the Russians forced us to shoot at our brothers in arms.
On October the 1st, 1944, Finnish and German troops clashed in Tornio, where the German supply camp, Pico Berlin, was located. It was under the command of a young lieutenant called Werner Herbrechtsmeyer.
At 2 in the morning, I was aroused by the sound of bullets hitting the hut. There was firing everywhere. An NCO came from the station and said, "It's the Finns. They've crossed the bridge and are shooting at us." 2 of my men are wounded. I can't imagine, I replied, that the Finns are doing that.
Herbrechtsmeyer went personally to the bridge over the Tornijoki.
We came across the German defences and took up our positions. Heavy machine guns. That can only be the Finns. My God, what's going on now? We're trapped.
Herbrechtsmeyer bore responsibility for 170 soldiers.
The last order I received was to hold Tornio to the last man. After that, the Finns cut all lines of communication.
As dusk fell over Tornio, the battle began. Several Finnish regiments attacked with heavy artillery and rocket launchers. But then the engagement came to an unusual end.
It was just before midnight. That's how long we'd been under fire. To the left of us, about 80 or 100 meters away, was the camp hut. And coming from it was the sound of singing and carousing. Sergeant Major Kuterna came up to me and said, "Sir, the Finns have found the schnapps." And when the Finns have got their hands on schnapps, they stop thinking about war.
Herbrechtsmeyer used the Finns' weakness for alcohol to escape with a handful of men, just 16 in all, and his hopes that the Finns would be drunk were dashed.
We pursued the Germans and reached Laudila on the Kemijoki River. From there, we went upstream.
Here, the Finns killed lots of Germans. The river ran red with their blood. Werner Herbrechtsmeyer was the only member of this troop to survive. The German troops flooding back found refuge in the Sturmbockstellung, as it was known. Here, on a tongue of land close to the Norwegian border, the Germans had established a final bastion. Werner Herbrechtsmeyer also managed to reach the protected position.
There, for the first time, I became involved in a discussion as to whether we could still win the war.
Können wir den Krieg denn noch gewinnen? Ich sag, Herbert, denkst du denn?
Herbert, I asked, what do you think?
Ja, sag doch.
I don't think we can win either, he said. How could we still manage it? He kept looking around. Be careful, he said. Be careful.
The local inhabitants were evacuated by force to Sweden, where the refugee camps were filling up. In the Arctic North, Hitler's scorched earth policy was being ruthlessly implemented.
I remember the evacuation. We'd gathered everything together in the farmyard. After all, they'd told us we were going to Sweden. It was a Sunday morning. We were given half an hour to pack.
Täällä oli niin sanotut alppijääkärit silloin.
At the time, the mountain infantry were stationed here. The entire troop was withdrawn. Their place was taken by soldiers who destroyed everything: villages, bridges, buildings.
Ne olivat SS-merkkisillä varusteilla.
They had SS insignia on their uniforms. They were SS troops from Norway. They were cold and hostile towards us, full of hate.
Ollaan vihoissa.
In this situation, Josef Puppitz became detached from his unit. Wandering around, he found an isolated farmhouse and spent the night there with a group of other German soldiers.
It suddenly felt very hot. Why had they turned the heating up so much, I wondered. Then I saw the place was on fire. The other soldiers had assembled for roll call and then headed off, leaving me behind. They'd set fire to the farmhouse. Fortunately, I managed to jump out of the window.
Se oli kuin maailmanloppu ihan mustana joka paikassa, kun
It looked like the end of the world. Everything was black. They'd set fire to everything. The ammunition the Germans had left behind exploded of its own accord.
Kauhia. Ei siinä muuta kuin ihmeteltiin.
It was terrible. We just didn't know what to do. This is the end, we told ourselves. We've no home anymore. There's not even a shed left on the farm.
Pihassa.
In northern Norway too, German units left nothing standing. By the time the last troops fled, the Red Army was already on Norwegian soil. At Kirkenes, 200 people hid for months in the ore mines. Their fear was that the Germans would evacuate them by force. Among them were lots of children.
We children sat on the railway lines all alone, waiting for the grown-ups. We had no idea what was happening outside. When the war was over, we were told to make our way to the entrance. The Norwegian flag was hung up and people began to weep. Even the very young ones understood that something special had happened. Then they began to sing the national anthem, Ja, vi elsker. Even today I get goose pimples whenever I hear it. That scene is engraved on my memory forever.
On May the 8th, Germany capitulated. In Norway too. The remaining soldiers fell in for roll call one last time.
An order came in and had to be read out in front of the company. I asked the officer on duty if he'd do it. Then I turned away. I had tears in my eyes. I honestly did. Young girls were dancing around and, out of sheer joy, giving one kiss after another. It was a fantastic atmosphere. What had happened was almost unbelievable. Everybody was shouting and singing. Then someone started singing Ja, vi älskar. Immediately, hundreds joined in.
In 1940, the Norwegian town of Narvik had been captured by German mountain troops. Now they were returning as British prisoners of war.
I left Norway from the same landing stage where I'd first set foot on Norwegian soil back in 1940.
When the war in Europe was finally over, no one was interested in the 11 men in the Haudagen weather station on North Eastland. From listening to the radio, they too knew that Germany had capitulated. What they wanted to know was,
Was wird aus uns?
What will become of us? We had no idea. We couldn't leave of our own accord. We were dependent on outside help.
The head of the expedition, Dr. Wilhelm Deger, knew what to do in this situation. He kept his men motivated, taking them on excursions into the eternal ice of the Arctic. They explored the land and its geology. It gave them something else to think about. Then, at last, on September the 3rd, 1945, a ship appeared on the horizon off Vordø Bay.
In the evening, a tiny ship, the Blasel, chugged into the fjord, decorated with a huge war flag. Up at the station, we lined up, and the ship weighed anchor. Dr. Deger went down, and he and the ship's captain hugged each other. We found that most unusual. We spent our last few hours there with the Norwegians. We gave one another presents. The Norwegians didn't have many of the things we had.
Sie konnten noch rauchen, wir haben alles gehabt noch.
We also offered them cigarettes. After all, we still had everything. Then, hesitantly, the captain said, "Somehow you still need to surrender." That, of course, was why they'd come. But no one knew how to go about it. We were still armed. So Dr. Deger took his pistol and placed it on the table and said, "I hereby surrender."
The Haudagen Weather Company was the last German unit to surrender in World War II. In Finland and Norway, the conflict had cost more than 100,000 lives.
We picked up Hans from the station. What a happy moment that was. The boy gave his father a bunch of flowers. Then we drove home. Yes, I loved him. All my life.
I visited his grave in Helsinki. I saluted and said, "You saved your people. Our leaders destroyed ours."